Hello and welcome to People Making Money. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time. This is kind of our original show that started out about 5 years ago. So thank you so much for those of you who started watching us way back when I turned my home in my living room into a studio and um, we videoed episodes once a month and then release them once a week after that. So if you really like that format, I've brought it back a little bit every other Thursday afternoon at 5 p.m. Western time, Pacific time, under the name Jiggers' Place. And so if you want to come and hang out with me there, the next show will be next week, which would be, I'll tell you here just a second. It will be August 1st at 5 p.m. Pacific time will be our next visit at Jiggers' Place. So have an interesting topic to talk to you about then. For today, I'm going to get into a topic I don't think I've discussed this before. It's the topic of taxes. Now, I'm not going to be talking about how to prepare your taxes. That's something for an accountant to do. What I am going to be talking about is all the myriad ways that taxes impact our economic well-being and our ability to build wealth, or maybe not all of them, but several of them. And I think it's important for us to address this subject because a lot of what goes on in the taxation sphere is, and I don't mean this purposely, but it's somewhat hidden from view so that we don't really see how taxes affect us. So yesterday I was listening to a podcast about, among other things, the difficulties that are going on in Oakland, California, terrible crime, etc. And there was one of the speakers was a man who I didn't know him, but his self biography was he had grown up in trouble with the police, gangs, that kind of stuff, and eventually he became a labor activist and like a community activist wasn't the word he used. I don't remember what it was now, but someone who was helping people in the community, in particular low income people. And the final question the moderator asked was, if you could change one thing, one law, state or federal, what would that law be? And surprisingly, this man said taxes. Now, that was a coincidence that I planned the show for today because I didn't know anything about what this particular podcast was going to be about. And the moderator asked him to clarify, raise taxes, lower taxes. He said, lower taxes, lower taxes. So his perspective was that the high taxes that are levied here in California hurt lower income communities the most because it discourages businesses from being created. So, and again, this is, I agree with him, by the way. I think that is the case. But it was interesting that here's someone, he was not a businessman. He's not someone that you would typically think of as being a low tax advocate, but indeed he was. And he was sincere. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a joke, right? So, but this is clearly he was a man who had educated himself about how economics works, and that's where I think many of us, our education is not as thorough as it might be. So most of us experience taxes through income taxes. So we all have, if we work, or even if we get certain government benefits, for example, Social Security in some cases, we pay federal income taxes. Now, what's interesting is in the early days of the income tax, which was created back in, I believe, 1933, there were no payroll deductions. That was something that came later. So people had to actually write a check for their taxes, and they felt the impact of the taxes in paying taxes in a very real way. And the income tax rate was very low when it was first started, a few percentage points, and it only affected people who made, at the time, quite a bit of money. So over the decades, the percentage of people who pay income taxes has grown enormously, as has the money collected and the percentage, I should say, the percentage of taxes levied. So even the lowest tax bracket today pays more than what the original income taxpayers paid roughly 90 years ago. So as the number of taxpayers increased and as the percentage of their income increased, that's why payroll tax deductions came along, because otherwise at the end of the year people just didn't have the money to pay their taxes. And so the system was set up so that in essence people they never saw the money. It was taken out of their paycheck before they received their pay, and then their employers sent it to the government. So unless you're a business owner or an entrepreneur, an independent contractor, you're not actually writing taxes for your income tax payments, your federal income tax payments. Now, many states subsequently also passed state income taxes, and so here in California, we pay both a state and a federal income tax. Now, in a state like Florida, I believe, has no state income tax. There's quite a number of states that don't have a state income tax. So this is how we normally experience taxation. The thing that's interesting and to keep in mind is the deductions made from our paychecks, if you're an employee, are not just for income taxes. So there's a great episode in the TV show Friends. I think it was in the first year of the show, where the Jennifer Aniston character, Rachel, has her first job and she gets her first paycheck, and she's surprised by how low it is compared to what she thought she was making. And she passes it to her friends like, oh no, this is pretty good. This is pretty good, because they're used to having taxes deducted from their paychecks. And she says, who's this guy FICA? Why is he getting all my money? Right? So FICA, the Federal Insurance Contribution Act, is what's more commonly known as Social Security. So in addition to deducting income taxes from paychecks, your employer also has to make a contribution for FICA and Medicare. Now, for many people, the deductions made for FICA and Medicare are as much as, sometimes if you're a fairly low wage employee, the deductions for FICA and Medicare are higher than your income tax deductions. So, it's FICA, I believe, is, I have to think about this for a second. I think it's 6.7% or something like that for the employee. And then Medicare is 1.45%. I could be a little bit off on these percentages. Now, your employer for FICA and Medicare matches those payments. So total Medicare tax is 2.9%, and total FICA is 15.3%. So FICA is 7.65 for each for each side. Now, when you're self-employed, you pay something called self-employment tax, which is basically the full amount of FICA and Medicare, right? So when people talk about, well, I'm going to go into business for myself and I'm going to make more money. Well, maybe, I mean, you may, but keep in mind that right off the top, you need to make an additional 7.689. You need to make over almost 10% more just to cover the additional taxes that you're going to pay. Okay. And then there are other taxes that our employer pays on our behalf that it doesn't come out of our paycheck, but they are still taxes that are due because we're an employee. So employers pay something called FUTA, Federal Unemployment Tax Assessment, or something like that. But they make a contribution to an unemployment fund. That's how we get paid. That's how an employee gets paid unemployment payments if they lose their job. Here in California, employers also pay SDI, which is a state disability insurance. Okay, and again, this doesn't come out of an employee's paycheck, but it's an additional payroll expense that the employer pays when that employer has employees. And if you're a sole proprietor, not a sole proprietor, sole proprietor. If you're a business owner or an independent contractor, so you'll have to pay those taxes on top of all the other taxes. You'll pay them for whatever income you take from your company. Now, those vary. I don't recall what the SDI rate is here in California, but the bottom line is, if you're making, let's say, $50,000 a year as an employee, as an independent contractor, you're going to need to make at least another 15%. So on $50,000, that's $7,500. You're going to need to make almost $58,000 a year just to have the same income you had as an employee. Now, I'm not saying this to discourage you from becoming a business owner or an independent contractor, but I am pointing this out so that you can understand the economics of that decision and plan for it appropriately. Okay, so you'll see situations, and maybe you've had this happen, where someone will go from being an employee to an independent contractor for the same company. Okay, and in that case, in order to at least come out roughly even, again, if the company was paying them $50,000 a year as an employee, and now the company is switching them to an independent contractor, the person needs to make close to $58,000 or thereabouts just to come out even. Now, the company will say, well, but now that you're an independent contractor, you can deduct X and Y and Z. Well, that may be the case, but that is irrelevant to the situation at hand if you want to keep your income stable. So they may say to you, well, you conduct your automobile expense. Well, that's true to a certain extent. However, if you are using your car for work, okay, your employer should have been reimbursing you for your mileage, and or you can, I believe, and this is something to check with your accountant, but you can deduct mileage that you used, that you put on your car, using it for the business that you're working for, not for going to and from work, but let's say you're already at work and you need to go to the office supply store to get something. So that mileage is potentially a tax deduction for you, even as an employee, or it should be something that your employer compensates you for. Okay, so the idea that certain things are going to be deductible And therefore, an employer shouldn't have to pay you more if you're converted to an independent contractor. It's not exactly true. I mean, you would have to look at your own specific situation to really know if you're going to get enough deductible expenses that you can take the same payment as an independent contractor as that you had as an employee. I would venture to say it's extremely unlikely that that would be the case. Okay, so the what you gain maybe in flexibility, just recognize you're going to lose at least somewhat in larger tax payments if you make that conversion. Okay, now you may be willing to do that, and that's if that's a decision you want to make, it's perfectly appropriate, but it should be a decision that you make going in. The other issue, and this is not strictly a tax issue, but I'm going to talk about this here just for a moment because it is something that's become increasingly expensive, and it's something I think sometimes we don't have in mind when we're working these things out, is if you're getting employer paid health insurance, when you become an independent contractor, almost for sure you're not going to get that insurance anymore. So you're going to have to pay for your own insurance. Oftentimes, health insurance as an independent contractor is more expensive than the cost of insurance when you're an employee for a company. So that's another source. That's another way that your compensation as an independent contractor will need to be enhanced. Okay, now, as an independent contractor, your health insurance payments may be tax deductible. Again, you need to talk to your accountant about that. But nonetheless, that's still an expense. And even if it's reduced by some tax savings, so let's say, you have to pay, I'm just going to use a round number, $1,000 a month, and it is tax deductible. So, out of that $1,000 deduction, you're going to save maybe $200 in taxes. Still, there's $800 there that you weren't paying before that you're going to have to pay now. And you can see, so there's $800 additional expense a month. That's $10,000 a year. So now instead of having to make $58,000 a year to stay even, you need to make $68,000 a year to stay even. Do you see that? So this is why it's critically important to understand these things and not be fooled by someone saying, "Oh, no, look, yeah, you have to pay for your own health." That's true, you have to pay for your own health, but it's deductible, so you don't have to worry about it. Well, yes, 100% of the cost may be deductible, but that doesn't translate into not having to bear that cost at all. Those are not the same thing. The fact that something is deductible does not mean that there's no cost to you. It just means that it will reduce your taxes by whatever percentage you're paying taxes. Okay, even if we say at the marginal rate. So if you're at a marginal rate of, let's say, 20%, okay, so all right, so $1,000 expense that's deductible saves you $200 in taxes. That's where I got that calculation just a moment ago. Fine, okay, but you still bore the other $800 expense that still came out of your pocket. Whether it came out of your business's pocket or your own is immaterial, because if you didn't have to pay that $800 expense for insurance, you would have had another $800 in income that you could use to pay for whatever it is you want to pay for: rent, clothes, food, a vacation, whatever it is, $800 a month. So these are things to keep in mind as we look more broadly at how taxes affect you. Okay, so I've talked about income taxes, which is the most common way that we pay taxes. The other one that's also very common and arguably more common, because even if you don't pay income taxes, you're buying stuff. And if you live in a state that has a sales tax, so then that's another way that we pay taxes. So here in Los Angeles, sales taxes are pretty close to 10% between the state of California, the county of Los Angeles, and the city of Los Angeles. Okay, so when I buy something, if I pay $50 for it, I'm going to pay another almost $5 in taxes on that item. Okay, so if in a year, let's say I spend $50,000 buying things, clothing, hair care products, the types of foods that are taxable at restaurants, for example. Okay, so if I spent $50,000, of that $50,000, actually a little over $45,000 of it was paying for what I got, and the rest, the other $4,700 or whatever, well, $4,500 is taxes. Now, if I didn't have to pay those sales taxes, I'd be able to buy more stuff or have more money to put in a savings account or something like that. Okay, so even if you pay zero income taxes, if you are buying anything, you're paying sales tax in most states. I'm not aware. There may be a state out there that has no sales tax. Now, clearly, some states have lower sales taxes than others. So, just to give you an example, I'm going to open up a spreadsheet I did here just recently. So, the sales tax in Asheville, North Carolina, for example, is 7%. Oh, okay, here is a state. Billings, Montana, okay, the sales tax is 0. There is no sales tax, evidently, in Montana. In Cheyenne, Wyoming, the sales tax is 6%. So you can see that those are significantly lower than here in California. Now, interestingly enough, if I go next door to Beverly Hills, okay, I actually pay a lower sales tax rate because although in Beverly Hills I pay the state and county rate, there is no Beverly Hills city sales tax. And so I save, I think it's 0.75% or something like that. Okay, and Beverly Hills did that on purpose to encourage people to come shop in Beverly Hills, right? So this is another way that taxes impact us. Okay, and you may be saying, well, governments need tax money to provide services, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, that's true. I'm not arguing the case for or against taxes per se. All I'm saying is we need to look at how taxes affect us more broadly. So if we make $50,000 a year, I'm just using that number, and if we pay, let's say, 10% of that in income taxes, so that's income taxes, FICA, that whatever all that stuff is, so that's $5,000 there. And let's say during the course of the year we spend about $20,000 on consumer goods, and we pay 5% on that. That's another $1,000 in taxes. So now our taxes are up to $6,000. Okay, just for those two types of taxes. Okay, another tax that is common, especially if you're a property owner, is property taxes. Okay, so here in California, this is going back to the late 70s, I believe. We had a proposition called Prop 13 that capped the property tax rate at 1%, plus another maximum of 0.25% for what are called special assessments. So special assessments are taxes that are levied to pay for specific improvements. It may be for sewer lines, it may be for road improvements, these types of civic improvements. So a local government can impose a special assessment on property owners in that area. Typically, they'll issue bonds, and then they'll levy a special assessment, and the money from that special assessment is used to pay off the bonds. Okay, so the maximum rate here in California is 1.25%. Okay, so if you own a house that's worth $500,000, okay, you're going to pay $5,000 in property taxes. I should say, by the way, let me be precise with my terms. If you own a house assessed at $500,000, okay, then you'll pay $5,000 a year in property taxes, okay, and a maximum of another $1,250 a year in special assessments. Now, not everybody pays the top rate, but some people do, okay, and then in certain areas, they've gotten around that cap through something called Mello-Roos, which is a fee imposed on property owners, residential property owners, for the infrastructure improvements that were made in order to build that subdivision of homes. So for those homeowners, it actually looks like they're paying more than 1.25% in property taxes and special assessments. What it really is they're also paying a Mello-Roos fee. But in any event, it would not be at all unusual if you had a home that was assessed at $500,000 to pay another $6,000 in property taxes. Okay, so if you're that $50,000 wage earner, we're already up to what do we say? $6,000 income taxes and sales taxes, and now another $6,000 in property taxes. Okay, so now you're up to $12,000 out of your $50,000 for taxes. Okay, now, how did you afford a $500,000 house? Well, maybe you have, you got a really low mortgage, 2.5%, a few years ago before the rates went up. And so, there you are. So your mortgage payments are low, but your, taxes are relatively high. Now, renters typically think, well, I'm renting, so I don't pay property taxes. Well, that's true. You're not writing a check to the county tax assessor. However, part of the rent you pay goes to pay the property taxes for that building. Okay, it's you could say, well, but that's coming out of the landlord's pocket. Well, that's true. However, if property taxes were lower, okay, that would tend to lower rents. Okay, now people say, well, no, the landlord would just take the savings and put it in his pocket. Well, that may be true if it's a very tight rental market and there's a strong demand for apartments. But right now, for example, here in the Southwest, vacancies are increasing and rents are tapering off and in some cases declining. So if property taxes were to drop, owners who are anxious to fill their building will compete for tenants by dropping their rents even more because they don't have to worry about paying as much in property taxes. Okay, so by doing that, tenants are paying a lower rent, at least in part because the property tax expense that the owner is paying have dropped. Okay, so this is another way that taxes affect us even when we're renters. Now, it's indirect, but nonetheless, higher property taxes will over time lead to higher rents, just like the increase of any expense. Okay, so if maintenance expenses go up, landlords are going to push rents higher in order to compensate for the higher maintenance costs. Okay, if interest rates on loans go up, landlords are going to look for ways to collect additional income in order to pay the additional interest on those loans. Now, in this respect, it sometimes takes time for the rents to increase after the expenses increase because depending on what kind of market you're in, if you're in a rent control market, the owner can't just increase rents. Or if you have a lease, the owner can't just increase your rent midway through the lease. He has to wait for the lease to be over. Okay. But at the point where either the lease is ended and you're month to month, or if there's rent control, and then and the anniversary of your tenancy has come, the owner is going to seek to increase the rents. And I can tell you this as having had a property management company. When expenses are going up, oftentimes landlords are more aggressive in seeking rent increases, even though it's riskier because the tenant may move out. But in order to be able to meet those higher expenses, the landlords will oftentimes take that risk. Okay, so taxes being an expense that an owner pays, property taxes being an expense that the owner pays, it essentially gets passed through to the tenants, not directly, typically in the case of an apartment, okay, but indirectly through how rents rise and fall. Okay, now I'm going to move over onto the business side of things for just a minute. I talked a few weeks ago about different types of leases. In particular, I talked about gross leases and net leases. So in a gross lease, I'm just going to real quickly review. The tenant pays whatever the rent is, $4,000 a month, and the landlord pays all the expenses for operating the building. In a net lease, the tenant pays their rent, $4,000 a month in this example, but they also pay for the expenses for operating the building. Their rent is a net number, meaning it's net of expenses, and expenses are paid on top of it. So if property taxes go up for a tenant who has a net lease, that tenant will right away pay more in taxes because of the higher property taxes. Now, the way it typically works is the tenant reimburses the owner, and the owner pays the property taxes, and the tenant reimburses the owner. Still, the higher cost for renting that space in the case of property taxes going up is an increase in your expenses due to taxes. So this is another way that taxes impact us financially that we don't necessarily think about. Now, let me take this one step farther. I talked about the indirect impact of higher property taxes on an apartment rent. Apartment rents are usually gross rents. So it doesn't mean that the tenant will directly pay more in rent, but the landlord is going to seek to increase the rent, okay, because of the higher property taxes. Well, even for a commercial tenant who has a gross lease, if property taxes go up, when the landlord has the opportunity, he will try to increase the rent to compensate for those higher property taxes. So he's not losing ground in terms of his cash flow from the property. Okay, so let's say an owner at the end of the year basically gets $10,000 cash flow out of a property. He's paid his expenses, he's paid his loan payments, right? He has $10,000 left over. And he gets his assessment for the following year for property taxes, and his property taxes are going to go up by $1,000. Okay? He has two choices. He can just accept that next year he's only going to make $9,000 instead of $10,000, or he can seek to increase the income for the property by at least $1,000. So he's still making $10,000, okay? And now the tenants, if there's one or more, collectively are paying an additional $1,000 in rent, or in the case of net leases, reimbursements. But in the case of a gross lease, they're going to look to pay it. He's going to look to have them pay an additional $1,000 in rent, so that he can at least stay even at his $10,000 cash flow. Okay, so let's say it's a retail shopping center, okay, and let's say there's 4 tenants, so and they all have the same amount of space, a quarter of the space in the shopping center. So he's going to seek to pass on $250 of that $1,000 property tax increase to each of the tenants. Okay. And you say, well, he shouldn't do that. He should just accept making only $9,000. Well, but if he's living off the income from that property is essentially his business, right? He probably doesn't want to take a salary cut or an income cut any more than you or I would want to. If our employer came to us and said, well, my costs of operating the business have gone up, so I need you to take a salary cut. We would be pretty incensed if the owner did that, right? I mean, by the way, we might have to if it meant the difference between the business closing and us losing our jobs or not. Okay, so I'm not saying it never happens, but in general, we would be pretty unhappy if if our employer's expenses went up and he turned to us and he said, so I need you, I'm going to be taking less income and you need to take less income for the coming year because our expenses are going to go up. That's not how we expect things to happen. What we would expect is the business somehow has to generate more income, so at least we can get the same salary in the coming year that we had in the previous year, right? So again, this is another way that taxes affect things. Okay. And so since we're on the business side of the ledger now, I want to talk about how taxes on businesses affect us, even if we don't own a business. Okay. So I've talked about how if a tenant in a let's say a retail center has a gross lease, even if I should say even if the tenant has a gross lease, if the property taxes for that property go up, the landlord is going to seek to increase the rent to compensate for the higher property taxes. Okay, so now I'm the business owner, right? And I get a rent increase from my landlord of $100 a month, okay, or $1,200 a year. So I have a couple of choices, right? I can either eat that additional cost and take less money out of the business for myself. That's one thing I can do. The second thing I can do is I can turn to my employees and say, I'm going to pay you less money. Okay. And I mean, I don't think it would be right for me to keep the same money and pay my employees less. But I think, it may be justified for me to say, look, I'm going to have to take more money. So I have to ask you to take, I'm going to take less. I'm taking less money. So I'm going to have to ask you to take less money. Okay. That may be another possibility. Okay. A third possibility is just cutting back on expenses somewhere else. Okay. So maybe I was providing, I don't know, free lunch once a week. Maybe I'll get rid of that. Okay. Maybe I was providing free snacks, water and chips or whatever. Okay. And I get rid of that. Okay. Maybe I fire an employee to reduce my overall labor costs. So instead of having, 5 people working at the business, now I have 4. Okay. And not having to pay that. Maybe that salary was a part-time salary. Okay. And so, okay, good. So I've got one big expense gone. So I'm not going to lose any ground there. However, what's going to happen with the tasks that fired employee used to do? Okay. I may have to do them, or I may assign them to one of the employees that I kept on. And so now they're having to do more work. Okay. Maybe they're paid hourly. So they don't mind because they're going to make more money. But and still net, I'll save on labor costs by getting rid of an employee. But now there's one fewer job, right? So they say, a recession is when this other person loses his job. A depression is when I lose my job, right? So, the business is going through a recession, but for the person who got, laid off or fired, that's a depression for him because he's got to go find a new job now, right? So, and by the way, it's not just taxes, of course, that can cause this. It can cause any increase in expense, but we tend not to think about taxes as being an expense to a business that has an impact on the employees and the compensation level at the business. Okay, minimally, if taxes go up, there's going to be pressure on the business owner to keep wages steady and not increase them because he's already paying these other higher costs. Okay, now, where eventually does the money come for the business to pay its taxes? Think about this for a minute, right? The money comes from selling the goods and services of the building. So this is the next option that the business owner has in order to pay for those higher taxes. He can increase the costs of the goods and services that he's selling and bring in more income, which then will pay for the higher taxes. Okay. As consumers, though, part of the price we pay for each product or service we buy from a business is helping pay the taxes for that business. Now, this is aside from sales taxes because the sales taxes are levied on top of the price we pay for goods and in some cases services. But embedded in the price of goods and services is the taxes, the expense for taxes that business pays. So when people talk about raising corporate taxes, raising taxes on businesses, okay, businesses are essentially pass-through entities, meaning that just like the little business I was talking about, if their taxes go up, one of several things is going to happen. Either compensation for the business owners and the employees are going to go down, or the number of people the company employs are going to drop, or other expenses are going to be reduced, which of course will cause a drop of income at other businesses that supply those things. I mentioned like snacks, right? If the business gets rid of free snacks for its employees, it's not just the employees who are losing out. It's also the business that was supplying the free snacks that are losing out because they're no longer getting that business. So you see the ripple effect. Okay? Or the business is going to raise its prices. Okay? And you say, well, let the owners of the business just accept less money. Well, same issue we were talking about a few minutes ago. Let's take a publicly traded corporation, okay, that's making billions of dollars, okay, and let's say that their taxes go up by $1 billion. Well, let's not make it that high. Their taxes go up by $100 million, okay, and let's say that company has 100 million shareholders who previously were getting dividends of $2 a year. One thing that company could do is cut its dividend by 50%. So instead of paying out $200 million a year in dividends to its shareholders, it could just pay out $100 million in dividends and then pay that other take that other $100 million and use it to pay the higher taxes. Okay. Now, if you're a shareholder in that company, is that going to make you happy? And the answer is no, right? Because let's say you owned 5,000 shares. So previously you were getting 5,000 times $2 a share in dividends, or $10,000 a year in dividends. Now you're only getting $5,000 a year in dividends. You're taking a pay cut. Okay. Now you say, well, but people who have dividends, they're rich. Well, sometimes, yes. Other times, though, dividends, shareholders are pension funds who hold shares on behalf of the plan beneficiaries, who are just, your average blue collar employee. Okay. They're not some, big, rich, $100 million net worth individual. They're people like, you and me. Right. And so it is, in the end, either the shareholders or the employees, right? Another thing that publicly traded company could do to make up the $100 million is they could lower compensation to its employees, including executives. Now, one of the gripes is the executive pay seems to keep going up, whereas sort of rank and file pay doesn't. Obviously a problem, okay? However, look, to a certain extent, that's how it works. Okay, so instead of giving employees a pay increase, the company may decide to use the additional income they have to pay the higher taxes, so that they can keep their dividend to the shareholders the same, and they can keep compensation for everybody the same, but nobody gets a pay increase. So in that case, the higher taxes are paid for by employees not getting a pay increase. Okay, so that's another way that taxes can affect you, is by, in essence, a foregone salary increase. Okay, you say, well, that's not fair. Okay, it may not be fair, but that is how the economics work. In other words, the business can't conjure up the additional taxes from nowhere. The business is going to find a way to pay for those taxes that does the least damage to the business. Now, when we say damage to the business, what do we mean? Well, the business will probably try to resist increasing prices for its products or services so that it doesn't lose customers. Okay? The business is probably going to resist cutting dividends, because if the business cuts dividends, that could lead to a drop in the value of the shares traded for the company. Now, why is that a problematic thing? Well, oftentimes, especially for senior executives, part of their compensation is tied to what happens to the value of the shares of the company, i.e., if the shares go up, their compensation goes up. Okay, because in general, we look at it as a good thing if you're building wealth for stockholders. So that's a good thing, and so you've done a good job, so you should get paid more. Okay, so that's another thing they're going to resist doing, is cutting dividends. Okay, so most likely what the business is going to look to do if taxes go up is to cut expenses. And expenses, come into a few basic categories. There's the cost of goods sold, which is acquiring the raw materials to make its product. There's labor, which is the cost of employees, right? There's general administrative, which is like office supplies, that kind of stuff. There's rent, or the cost of having the facility where the business operates. That may include maintenance. Okay, and maybe there's other expenses, including taxes. Okay, so you can now, typically for a business, one of the biggest expenses it has is labor. So where is a business going to look to cut expenses? Labor. Okay, and this is why oftentimes you'll see businesses lay people off when their expenses increase. So here in California, this is not a direct tax issue, but here in California, the minimum wage for fast food workers increased as of June 1st or July 1st, we've already seen a drop in employment among fast food workers as a result. Okay, that's how the owners of these fast food restaurants are dealing with the higher labor costs. They're essentially looking to do more with fewer people. Okay. By the way, the other thing that happens is when costs go up, businesses look to substitute technology for people because although there may be a big upfront cost to acquiring new technology, over time, that technology tends to get cheaper. Okay, so that's one way of controlling labor costs is to invest in technology. That's why, like when I was in Israel, for example, you go to the McDonald's there, they have a kiosk that you order from because it means they need less employees in order to run that McDonald's. And the employees cook the food and bag it, and you go to the kiosk, you order it up, you pay for it, and you get your ticket. And then I forget if they call the number, whatever they do, you walk up and you get your food, right? As opposed to, no, that was a kosher McDonald's. That's why I was able to eat there. As opposed to how a McDonald's here works, which I think you still walk up and you order from a person, et cetera, et cetera. That's how it worked when I was a kid, right? So going back to this issue of higher taxes for a business, this ultimately, the people who use the business end up paying for those higher taxes. Okay. Either, or the people who work for the business end up paying for those higher taxes, either in wage increases they didn't get, or in employees being laid off, or in some cases in wages being dropped. Okay. Or the consumers pay for it because the company decides they do have to raise their price. Okay. And so now we're paying more for the same amount of goods or services that we were getting before. Okay. So, like any expense, that's what taxes do. So, this is another indirect effect of taxes on us. Okay. And this is why, by the way, I think that this fellow who I was listening to on the podcast yesterday, who was an advocate for low income people, was saying he would lower taxes. That would be his number one change in the law. People think, well, lower taxes only benefits the wealthy. That's not really true. In fact, taxes in general are regressive, meaning that they impact lower income people more than higher income people. So if there is a flat tax rate, okay, sales tax rates are a perfect example. Sales tax rates are regressive. Why? Because lower income people spend a higher percentage of their money on taxable goods. Okay, so a higher percentage of their income goes to pay sales taxes than someone who's wealthier, who, there's a certain point at which you don't use your money to buy more stuff. You start investing. You put it in a savings account. You put it in a 401k. You buy some stocks or bonds, or you invest in another business or something like that. None of those expenditures, investments, you don't pay taxes on them when you make the expenditure. You may pay taxes when you get the money back in terms of capital gains taxes, which we didn't talk about today, for another time perhaps. But you don't pay a so-called consumption tax, which is what a sales tax is, or a VAT, a value-added tax. That's a consumption tax. So sales taxes and value-added taxes are regressive in that they impact lower income people more than higher income people. So in a state like California, where sales taxes are quite high, okay, so they actually hurt lower income people more. They also discourage businesses from starting. Okay, so if you have a high tax cost in a state like California, it's much more difficult, not more difficult to start a business per se, but to make that business successful. And again, that's why this fellow, I think, was saying, well, he would lower taxes, because he knows that one of the solutions to poverty is the ability for people to start businesses and make them a success more easily, even if it's just a little side business. That's good. So for example, cutting hair on the side, or selling things that you make on Etsy or something like that. All those little side businesses can be very helpful for people on the lower end of the income range, because they can make some extra money. But if taxes are high, so that by the time they pay all their taxes, they get very little money out of their side gig, it doesn't make sense for them to do it, right? They can't better their situation by doing that. Okay, so we're coming up on the end of the show, but I was, because we're in an election year, and as you know, I don't do politics, but I do economics, and taxes are an important economic concept. And so when people talk about raising taxes or lowering taxes, or taxing this group or this other group or whatever, what's important is that we understand what are the impacts of those policy proposals. How will they impact us as individuals? How will they impact our community? How will they impact other people? Okay, how will they impact our local economy, our state economy, our national economy, our standing in the world? Okay, because tax rates are competitive across national borders as well. So I've talked about both the direct and the indirect impact of taxes. Hopefully you have a better understanding now of how each of us are impacted by them. Now, I kept the discussion pretty basic. Okay, we could have lots more complexity to it, and maybe we'll readdress this subject down the road and get into some more complexity, talking about things like I mentioned very briefly, capital gains taxes, right? There are things like excise taxes, tariffs, which are really just another form of taxation. All of those have impacts as well. Didn't have time to get to them today, but they are things that we should understand. So maybe for another time, right? This is an almost endless topic, especially since the old adage, nothing is sure but death and taxes, and I think we're making more ground with death than we are with taxes these days, thank goodness. But I invite your thoughts, your comments, your perspective on this. The links to my social media will be in the show notes after this episode posts on YouTube. And so feel free to click through and leave a comment, good or bad. I'm brilliant, I'm stupid, it's fine. I take no offense. But we can certainly have a discussion. I really, truly love to hear what you think. Now, if it's something personal or private that you don't want to share with other people, my email address will be there as well. You can send me a private email, or you can DM me through social media. Just, I always give this caveat. If the question you ask me is something outside of the realm of my expertise, I won't be able to answer the question, but I will do my best to refer you to someone who can. So try and help you out in that way. So I thank you very much for watching today. Hope you enjoyed it. This wraps it up for us for this week. Next week at 10 a.m. Monday, Pacific time, these are all going to be Pacific time, is my show, Trusts and Estates Weekly. On Tuesday is Business Lessons from the Military, also at 10 a.m. Pacific. A week from today, on Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, is the next edition of People Making Money. And I'm gonna prompt my guest. My guest is Adam Wiseman, who is an entertainment lawyer in New York. And Adam is going to talk about being involved in the media and entertainment businesses realm. I don't think I've had someone talk about that before. You would think, being so close to Hollywood, I would, but I, went all the way to New York to get a guest. I know you will enjoy hearing Adam speak. Very clear thinking, articulate individual. So please do consider joining us next Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time. And then Thursday of next week at 5 p.m. Pacific time is the next edition of Jiggers' Place. For those of you who have seen the first episode or saw the introductory one I did a couple of weeks ago, you know that Jiggers was my dog. He holds a very special place in my heart, and having a show named after him is it's just it gives me kind of warm all over feeling. So I'd love for you to come and relax on Thursday afternoon for a half an hour, enjoy a cocktail with me while we talk about all kinds of things that aren't related to our business and professional lives. So once again, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your watching the show, supporting it, and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my bell.